For many years now, Stephen King has consistently remained among the top 30 richest writers in the United States of America. He earns about $30 million a year. Publishers fight for the right to release his next novel, while the total circulation of King's books in the United States has surpassed a record 270 million copies. That is nearly one book per American. King has published more than 30 novels, 5 collections of short stories, and around 10 screenplays. And every one of his eerie tales became a bestseller, reprinted, adapted for the screen, and translated into almost every language in the world. In his books, reality is never entirely real, and the dead are never completely dead. For a quarter of a century, he has been frightening people, and they absolutely love it. Horror is as necessary to the modern reader as medicine, Stephen King once said, and for that same quarter of a century, no one has managed to truly figure out who he really is. King loves to talk about himself, but reading his interviews rarely helps one understand what kind of man he actually is. He recalls his childhood somewhat reluctantly, insisting to curious journalists that everything was ordinary, just like with other kids, that he was obedient, never upset his mother, and did not even play with matches. But one day he admitted, "For my parents, I was an unplanned child, which means I came to your earth completely by accident." His father, Donald King, went through many different professions. He too had a passion for writing horror stories, but the manuscripts he sent to publishers were always returned with polite rejection letters. And so it went until one strange evening in 1949, when Donald said to his wife, "Ruth, I'm going out to buy a pack of cigarettes. I'll be back in a couple of minutes." He stepped out and was never seen again. Stephen was 2 years old. His brother David was 4. David said to Stephen, "Aliens took Dad away." "I was an absolutely normal teenager," King tells journalists. "My friends and I spent our time the same way millions of other absolutely normal teenagers did." In his semi-autobiographical novella, Cha-Cha, The Body, Stephen and his friends wander through the forests of Maine, searching for the corpse of a missing boy from their town. When Stephen was 13 years old, his mother, Ruth King, walked into his room one day and discovered how her quiet son spent all his free time. He was collecting and pasting into an album photographs and newspaper clippings about bloody crimes committed by famous serial killers. Mrs. King was horrified, and the whole thing nearly ended with a visit to a psychiatrist. But Stephen himself saw nothing strange about his hobby. He simply called it gathering information. The fate of his early works, much like that of his father's stories, was rather discouraging. No one wanted to publish them. So when, as a college student, Stephen King managed to sell one of his short stories to a magazine for $8.35, his joy was beyond words. He recalls that period of his life with great pride. After graduating from the University of Maine, he earned a degree in English language and literature. The only thing he could hope for then was a modest teacher's salary, $6,400 a year. His stories were still being rejected everywhere, except by cheap men's magazines like Dude and Swank. Stephen and his wife Tabitha lived in a tiny trailer, and they barely had enough money to pay rent for even that modest home. Tabitha worked at Dunkin' Donuts, selling pastries, while Stephen toiled in a laundry, spending his nights finishing his first full-length novel. In 1973, a publishing house bought the rights to Carrie, and Stephen King received his first substantial paycheck, $200,000. "I found out the book had been sold on a Sunday," he recalled. "I was walking through the streets of our small town, absolutely beside myself with happiness. I really wanted to buy Tabitha a present, but all the stores were closed. So I went into a pharmacy and bought her a hairdryer. That hairdryer became a wonderful surprise for Tabitha. Stephen had always loved surprising her. Once, as usual, he got up very early, went to a nearby lake, and caught a huge bass. When he came home, King quietly slipped into the bathroom, placed the fish inside the toilet, closed the lid, and calmly went down to the dining room. A little later, his half-asleep wife went to the bathroom. Apparently, the fish splashed at exactly the wrong moment, because the poor woman's terrified screams woke up half of Bangor. Over the years, however, Tabitha King grew used to her husband's peculiar sense of humor. They had met back in college. She considers him the best husband and father in the world. He, in turn, calls her his greatest muse and protector against all fears and nightmares. No one knows why, at some point, Tabitha suddenly left Stephen King. And no one knows why, sometime later, she just as suddenly returned to him. Journalists often pester the king of horror with the question of whether he considers himself a normal person. To this he smiles wearily and replies, "The same things that worry and frighten you also worry and frighten me. Otherwise, none of this would work." Once, however, he mailed in a questionnaire for an anonymous psychological study conducted by one of the leading psychiatric institutes in the United States. The doctor's conclusion was clear: paranoid schizophrenia. King despises psychoanalysts. People pay them $75 to $90 an hour to banish their fears. I get paid about the same, but for doing exactly the opposite. I prefer to exercise my fears on my own, the maestro once said. When a truck nearly ran over my little son one day, instead of torturing myself with nightmares and anxiety, I sat down at the computer and wrote Pet Cemetery, a story about how it could all have ended. King has other ways of dealing with fear. He constantly tosses salt over his shoulder, always knocks on wood, hates black cats and black birds, and nothing in the world could make him walk under a ladder. He believes that giant muskrat-sized rats live in the New York City sewers, that his computer has been running for years without electricity, and that when a person suddenly shivers, it is because a goose has just flown over the place where their grave will one day be. When leaving a hotel room, King always leaves the light on. "I do not want to come back and feel someone else's fingers on the switch," he says mysteriously to anyone who asks. He is afraid of mice, spiders, funerals, elevators, airplanes, abandoned houses, cemeteries, the number 13, and death itself. He never goes to bed without a nightlight turned on. Stephen King's least favorite holiday is Halloween. Every year, on the eve of All Saints' Day, the guards at his mansion hang a stern warning signed by the King of Horror. It declares that children who spend the night trick-or-treating should not even think about crossing the boundaries of his estate. They will not get a single candy or cookie. A terrible fate supposedly awaits any reckless kid who dares to ignore this rule. So far, not a single child in Bangor has been brave enough to test the wrath of the dreadful Stephen. In Bangor, people treat him with a certain unease. Probably, in the entire history of this small Maine town, no other local celebrity has inspired so many rumors and strange stories as Mr. King. Walk into any local pub, buy a couple of shots of Jack Daniels for one of the regulars, wait for the right moment, and then casually ask about the man who lives in the mansion with the bats on its gate. After giving you a long, suspicious look, the locals will tell you all sorts of fascinating things. For instance, that King is completely insane, that the dogs guarding his mansion are actually werewolves, just like the ones in his twisted books, and most importantly, that every Friday, Once the clock strikes midnight, Mr. King leaves his cursed house and walks toward the nearest forest. Those brave enough to follow him swear that the creatures who come out of the forest to meet him look nothing like humans. Not in height, not in form. Their yellow eyes glow like two tiny moons, and Stephen King quietly speaks to them in a strange, clipped language, with the air of a man showing great respect. There are as many people in America who fear and hate King as there are those who adore him. Many see him as a mouthpiece of demonic forces, an antichrist who muddles the minds of good Christians with blasphemous heresy. Some claim his novels are dangerous, that they teach young people violence and corrupt them even worse than drugs. The fiercest clash with public opinion came in the late 1970s, after a wave of terrorist attacks by high school students swept across America. Each of these crimes eerily mirrored the plot of King's novel Rage, in which a mentally unstable student brings a gun to school, kills a teacher, and holds his classmates hostage. The kids who did these things probably read my book, King admitted sorrowfully. If there's anything in my career I truly regret, it's writing Rage. But I hardly think I can be held directly responsible for those terrible acts. It's like killing the messenger who brings bad news. Even today, dozens of anonymous letters filled with curses and threats continue to arrive at his address. One day, while Stephen was working in his study, the doorbell rang. Tabitha opened it and found a strange young man standing on the doorstep, holding a small package. "I have a bomb," he said in a grave, hollow voice, "and I'm going to blow you all to hell." Luckily, it turned out the bomb was fake, and the young man was just a failed writer who believed Stephen King had stolen his idea for Misery. After that incident, however, King decided to entrust his family's safety to professional bodyguards. Since then, for many years, he has rarely left his mansion. In life, only two things truly interest him: baseball and literature. In his backyard, King built a small baseball field. According to rumors, this little indulgence cost him about $1 million. The renovation of the Bangor Public Library was also financed entirely by King. "I just love to read," he replied modestly when journalists asked about such an unprofitable investment. His literary tastes, however, are quite unusual. For example, King has read every novel by Dean Koontz and Raymond Chandler, yet he has never opened a book by Leo Tolstoy, and no one can convince him that Tolstoy might be more interesting. About 10 years ago, the reading world was shaken by sensational news. Stephen King publicly promised never to write another horror novel. Some said he had simply burned out. Others claimed he was afraid, that he had come too close to the edge separating the visible world from the invisible. Skeptics, however, were not convinced. After all, everyone knows that demons released by imagination are not easily forced back into their cages. Year after year, they gain more power over their creator, and escaping from the looking glass is far more difficult than entering it, especially when it is your own personal looking glass. King himself admitted as much in one interview. "What I fear most in life is losing my imagination as a writer, waking up one morning and finding nothing inside, just emptiness." Naturally, he failed to keep that promise. On the contrary, the heroes of his later novels have ventured ever deeper into the strange, tangled jungles of the mind, wandering through the dark, sticky corridors of the subconscious. What truly amazes people is his almost maniacal work ethic. Every morning, to the sound of music broadcast by his own Bangor radio station, Mr. King sits down at his desk and begins to write, for at least 4 hours a day. This rule is broken only twice a year, on the 4th of July, America's Independence Day, and on September 21st, his birthday. Only on those 2 days does the maestro allow himself to relax a little. Yet every year he still produces several new works. With each passing year, however, his eyesight grows worse. The reason is a serious progressive illness, degeneration of the eye muscles, which forces the writer to wear stronger and stronger glasses and may one day lead to complete blindness. He can hardly see anything directly in front of him now. Only his peripheral vision still works well. Stephen King jokes about it. As a writer, I hope to keep that ability for as long as possible, to see what happens at the edges, in the dark corners. If you ever happen to visit Stephen King, and he invites you into his study, do not be surprised if, after a while, you realize that you are suddenly alone. "My study is my favorite place in the house," King once said, "because it has a secret door. One of the bookshelves slides aside and reveals a staircase, and the moment my guests get a little bored or distracted, I slip behind it and disappear." Where exactly the king of horror disappears to from his study, and from where he returns, no one knows. No one except Stephen King himself.